it's your girl Z from TransVoiceLessons.com.
And today we're going to talk about why voice terms suck so bad. Why are there so many terms? Why is there so much fancy language? It's all so confusing. Well, today we're going to make sense of all that and more. Terms really do matter, and I promise that if you listen and watch this, you will walk away being able to navigate all the resources on this channel and other channels much easier. So let's get started. Imagine every element that we talk about in voice is like a hydra. It has a main body, but there's multiple faces to it. We will call these different faces lenses or frames because they give us something to look through. We're going to talk about 3 different lenses: the sensory experience, the acoustic description, and the biomechanical process. All of these are slightly different. The sensory description refers to our direct experience, what it sounds like. The acoustic description describes what happens when we measure it. What do we get objectively happening in the signal? And then the biomechanical process describes what physically has to happen in order for this acoustic signal to be generated in order for us to experience the thing. These are not equal. The sensory experience is your individual experience. The acoustic description is kind of what it is in a signal sense, and the biomechanical is more of a how it works. And what we'll find is that the most direct but the most subjective is the sensory experience. In the middle, we have the acoustic, and the most objective but the most abstract is the biomechanical description. Let's do a basic example. So let's talk about pitch, right? Everyone knows what pitch is, right? Well, you might be surprised. So most people tend to think that pitch is frequency, right? I ask so many people this question. Everyone answers it this way because it makes sense, right? Well, this is the problem. They are not the same thing. They do not mean the same thing. Pitch is a sensory experience that humans have. Pitch is subjective. Pitch is the sensory experience of high and low. That's it. If something sounds higher or lower, the pitch is different. Now, frequency is the acoustic parallel. You might be thinking, well, Z, does this really matter? I mean, is there actually a difference?
And at first, these differences may seem trivial, but there are all sorts of situations where I could organize frequencies in such a way to make you hear pitches which cannot be measured. Pitch and frequency are different descriptions. They exist to different lenses of experience.
And when we talk about frequency, we have now removed it one level of experience. Let's work backwards and understand why this matters. So if we're thinking about what pitch is on a biomechanical level, oh my God, it's so complex. It is so insanely complex. There's tension, there's mass, there's airflow, there's all these little factors which ultimately influence vocal fold oscillation rate, which ultimately produces all these harmonics, and then the lowest one is perceived as a fundamental frequency, which ultimately is just high or low. By thinking in sensory terms, we make it less complex. We don't need to talk about this or this. We need to talk about this. And that's one of the issues and a very deliberate, intentional move away from my old content. If you go back, my earliest videos in 2017, 2016, we're talking about this stuff, right? And then in around 2019, I'm really talking a lot about this stuff. And by 2020, I'm almost exclusively talking to beginners about this stuff. And there is a very specific reason. It's because it is more actionable and easier for individuals to do. That is how you navigate your body and your actions, through your direct experience. You cannot directly experience biomechanical reality. Trying to learn voice control through understanding biomechanics is a lot like trying to learn how to dance by studying your bones, your muscles, and your tendons. That's not what allows you to dance. Experience and action is how you learn to dance. So here's a breakdown of some pretty important vocal components and how they will use different language depending if we're talking about the sensation of it, the acoustics underlying it, or the biomechanics which give way to this process.
So let's use pitch as an example.
We're talking about the sensory experience of high and low, and that corresponds mostly to the fundamental frequency that we could measure, which corresponds to this really complex biomechanical process of vocal fold oscillation rate. When we think about the sensory experience of weight, vocal weight perception, we are talking about the relative saturation in the sound. Is it heavy? Is it dense? Is it light and not so dense? And that corresponds to an acoustic feature called spectral roll-off, which is really cool. I've talked about this in some videos already. And we can think that this is roughly a biomechanical proxy around vocal fold mass. So if you pay attention, I made that video vocal fold mass in like 2020, and that was right before I switched all my language over to the sensory experience. And so now when I'm talking about, vocal fold mass, I'm really just talking about perceptual weight, because that's a more direct way to think about it. Now, resonance is a little interesting. I want to work backwards on this one.
So for instance, if you're describing resonance as how big or small the vocal tract is, that's a biomechanical description. That's far removed from the actual useful experience that you'll have to control resonance. As we make that chamber bigger and smaller, we drive resonant frequencies around, and now we're talking about the acoustic description. And then as those resonant frequencies are driven around, we tend to hear the thing as sounding even larger or even sounding smaller,
which is perceptual size. So if I say, so this sound is larger, that sound was larger than this sound, the resonance is ultimately what's changing there, yes, but we hear it as the effect of perceptual size. This is so important. Perceptual size is what we are trying to change when we deal with feminizing or masculinizing our resonance. And it is a much more direct way to understand it than thinking about it as resonance by itself or vocal tract size by itself. And that is why the sensory experience is, yes, it's the most subjective, but it's also the most actionable. And as we move away from that, things become increasingly more abstract and increasingly harder to directly apply in your vocal journey.
Think of it like color. When you're talking about your favorite color, or when you are playing with colors in art, you're not thinking about the wavelengths of light. You're simply guiding yourself based off the experience you have of seeing color. And this is what we mean when we say there are multiple descriptions for a similar thing. So for instance, color would be the sensory experience you have when you see color. The wavelength of light would be the optical measurement of maybe what generates that color. Now, the other description lens is the mechanical lens. So in this case, it would be like you have rods and cones inside your eye, and when they take wavelengths of light optically, they then create this crazy process, which then gives us an experience. So there is the experience, there is the measurement, and then there is the mechanical process that gives rise to all of that. Each of these are one level further removed from your experience. So we have the sensory experience, which is the most sort of honest experience in the process. Then we have the sort of measurement, the optical or acoustic frameworks. And then we have the mechanical frameworks. So you can see these are very subtle distinctions, but they make a really big impact once you're aware of this. Oftentimes students are sitting around trying to think about controlling parts inside their body, but that's not really the way you learn to control your body. We learn to control our voice through listening and attempting to create what we heard. That's how you did it as a baby, so why would you try to fight that and do it a different way now? You already have all the fundamental skills in place when you were 2 years old to learn how to modify your voice. You just have to play into those strengths. Understanding what description is being used and understanding what description you are meaning to use can really help you communicate more clearly about voice. It can help you understand voice resources a lot better, and it can keep you from making a really common mistake that beginners make, which is focusing too much on the biomechanics or the acoustics of the process without having enough of that supportive listening and subjective experience backing it. Don't get me wrong, the acoustics and the biomechanics are definitely useful. That's why I fell in love with them for many years. However, when you are trying to learn, acoustics and biomechanics are more abstract. They're further away from the directness of the topic. And for that reason, they act like meta information. It's meta knowledge. You can use knowledge of acoustics and biomechanics to come up with new sounds, but the natural process for most voice learners is the opposite. By playing with the sounds, you gain awareness of the biomechanics, or vice versa. We can always think in the subjective auditory lens, we can think in the acoustic lens, we can think in the biomechanical lens, we could even think in the behavioral lens, and probably more. But those three that we talked about today are the main lenses that I encourage you to keep in mind when you're exploring voice resources, and it may keep you out of trouble and keep these things a little more clear from one another. So I hope this helps. I know it can be confusing with all the terminology and different language, but this should hopefully simplify it for you. If you're a beginner or intermediate person, you should pretty much be thinking on that subjective sensory experience lens, which is why you should be training your ear and trying to take action with your voice, finding sounds you like, trying to imitate sounds that you like. All those things are naturally going to make you better at voice. And then, of course, if you have an interest in voice and how it works, then definitely learn the acoustics of it. Definitely learn the biomechanics of it. It's really fascinating. It's beautiful stuff. But if you're just a vocalist, you just need to listen and do. So yeah, that's all for this video. I hope you found it helpful. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy the content on this channel. Don't forget to check us out on Patreon if you'd like to support the work we do here on this channel. If you'd like to work together in private lessons or group lessons, please just check us out at the link below. And otherwise, thank you all so much for listening and have a beautiful rest of your day. Bye!